Okay. Hello, hello.
Agora sim. Foi. Sem som.
Okay. Let me add Dr. Anica. Okay. All right.
Sem som.
Hi, guys.
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me
Can it,
well?
yes, I can. Can
Awesome.
everybody hear me? Todo mundo ouvindo aí? I think so. So, Dr. Anica, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for accepting to do this. It's I really appreciate it.
Of
For
course.
yeah, and I believe many people will appreciate it too. And first, like I want to like to tell everyone like how we met. It was like about a year and a half ago, right?
Hmm?
Yeah, it was at the Langston Hughes house
Hmm?
at an event, which was a great event, by the way, right?
Good.
It was a Christmas event with a great music. And Dr. Nika was telling me about her work and the things that she does, and I was just so impressed with all that. And when I was, just planning to do something like that on Instagram, I immediately thought of you, and I thought that you will be great, to just shed some light in everything that's going on right now.
Sure. Thank you so
So
much for having me. I'm really excited about our talk, and thanks to everyone watching. I hope you have some good questions because we wanna hear what you have to say too.
yes. So first of all, could you introduce yourself to everybody? Like, tell us about your
Sure.
work. Yeah.
So I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I am based primarily in New York City, where I live. I started a company called Race Positive, and it's through that company I really believe in the power of talking, and it's probably because I'm a psychologist, but I believe that healing comes when we talk, right? When we're willing to talk about things. And often I find that when it comes to conversations around race, the conversation is very, very negative and very unproductive. And so I wanted to do something where we can have honest conversations around race that actually moved us forward and did more producing, more problem solving than sort of bashing and this just negative back and forth. So the whole goal of race positively is to engage, it's to equip, it's to empower people to be able to dismantle all forms of racism, prejudice, and bias in their unique spheres of influence. Because I can't show up at the Thanksgiving dinner with your family, but you can. And if I help you figure out how to sit in that space and have these conversations, then you can take that with you into every space that you go into. And together, we can dismantle these things. As it says on my website, I firmly believe that racism is a thing that affects all of us, and so dismantling it is going to require all of us. And the protests that we see happening all over the country and now the world says just that, which makes me really happy.
Yeah. And could you tell us like what's your website? Like just so
Sure, it
everybody.
is
Yeah.
www.draniga.com, and it's doctor spelled out. So it's DoctorAnica.com.
Perfect.
Sure.
So you just mentioned the protests, and it's a really historical moment right now that we're going through. And I just wanted you to, first of all, like walk us through what's happening. Like we watched the news, we saw that there was the murder of George Floyd by a white police officer, and that started all the protests and I believe the biggest wave of protests since
Mm-hmm.
1969. I believe that's what they're telling us. So
Yeah.
we see the news and everything, but walk us through the whole situation for someone maybe who's not familiar with the news or what's going on.
Yeah. So it's important to know that while the protest is centered around George Floyd, it's so much more than George Floyd that people are protesting against and for, right? So what has happened is that for centuries now, we've had something called systemic racism that is built into the fabric that is the American life. And I'll talk more about what that means in a bit, but we've had systemic racism and it's shown up in multiple ways. It's shown up in health disparities. With COVID happening, I mean, we, I think, are the leading country now in the world for the number of deaths due to COVID. But if you look deeper into those numbers, you'll see that people who are Black and brown are dying at twice or more the rate of white people. And that isn't just because they're Black and brown, and being Black and brown makes you more susceptible to COVID, but it's because when you're Black and brown, the likelihood of getting quality health care is lower. The likelihood of being in a neighborhood where you have access to healthy food options is lower. Those factors are what is making people more susceptible to getting COVID and therefore dying at a higher rate. So those are all sort of the brainchild, right, of systemic racism. And one thing that we see George Floyd's death coming into is the killing and the shooting of unarmed, we see coming in with the death of Mr. Floyd. And what happened there was he was arrested for supposedly passing a fake $20. We still don't know if it actually was fake. I haven't heard anyone confirm or deny that yet, but that's something that has been, was suspected. He was arrested, and in the process of being arrested, we see him being handcuffed, we see him being put into a car, the police car, we see him being punched relentlessly, and then he's ultimately on the floor, on the street, I should say. While on the street, we see two police officers, one on his, kneeling on his back, the other on his leg, and another is kneeling directly on his neck, while a fourth police officer is standing guard, basically preventing anyone from intervening. And you have onlookers saying, look, this man is bleeding, he's saying he can't breathe, you guys get off of him, he's not resisting anymore. And they did not relent in any respect. And for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that they stayed on him and on his neck, and he ultimately died right there, with his last breath saying, I can't breathe, and crying out in pain for his dead mother, which is pretty heart-wrenching. And this was all captured by a 17-year-old girl, and she shared that video with the rest of the world, and so we all saw it. And this is coming on the heels of, I believe, days, if not a week prior, we had all heard of a man named Ahmaud Arbery, who was just jogging in his neighborhood, and two white men decided that he was a burglar, though they had no proof. And so they chased him down in their car. They shot and killed him on the spot. And for 2 months, nothing happened to them. It wasn't until there was a video of the shooting that was released, then those men were finally arrested. And then you see there's a whole system that is in place that really is having these experiences where Black and brown people are dying and are being tried and convicted and sentenced in the street, and little to no consequence happening to the ones who are doing it. And that inequity, again, is the brainchild of systemic racism. Right.
And like, at what point, like, do you think this particular case inspired all the, the protests and hurt? And like, do you think it was because it was successive? I mean, like a number of cases that happened, like in a row, or do you think it was because the video was so shocking and people could actually see these things happening? Or what do you think that actually triggered this?
I think it's all of the above plus COVID, right? So what I mean by plus COVID-19.
COVID, yes. Okay.
Right? And what I mean by that is COVID forced all of us to stop. We couldn't be entertained anymore. We couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't do anything. We were forced to just stop and pay attention to what was happening in our country and around the world. And because of that, when these videos came out, we had nowhere else to look. We had to tune in. And I think what it forced us to do is pay attention, because we've seen videos before and there have been outcries before. But I think one of the reasons it has been as great as it has been, this response, is because everyone for the first time was forced to look and to pay attention. And when you see ugliness like that, if you have any kind of moral conscience, it's hard to look away and it's hard to sit and not say something. And so I think we're seeing this from years and years of work and effort by so many people, but with the country being forced to pay attention for the first time in a really long time, I think we now have this activity and this reaction that's really important.
Okay. So you talk about systemic racism, and which is it the same as a structural racism?
Yeah, they're interchangeable.
Yes. Okay. And I was going to ask you, like, particularly looking at this police officer and other police officers, I want to understand, like, how does it get to that point? You know, like, what were the things that went through his mind, or maybe he growing up, things that maybe were unchecked, you know, some that led to him just not doing his job of protecting the person that he was arresting, which is like supposed to be his number one job, you know?
Right, yeah. I think it's important to, I can't tell you what was in his mind the minute he was doing it, right? That would be a power I do not possess. But I do think what's important to see is that there are a lot of things that contributed to help make that moment happen. Right?
Exactly. That's what I get it.
Yeah, and so some of those things that made that moment happen is living in a culture and it's a society that tells you that the cries of a Black person are not to be heeded and not to be respected, right? It tells you that when you are in a space where the value of a Black person or a person who's darker skinned is lesser than one who's lighter skinned, then you learn that you don't need to pay attention or seek their well-being as much as you would someone who is higher valued. It comes from years of the dehumanizing of Black and brown people, where for some reason we're constantly told and seen as not being as human, as worthy, as valuable. I'm going to keep using that word, as valuable as other races. And so if you're steeped in that, if I've been telling you and showing you for decades that these people are not to be valued, that they're not human in many respects, that they are not valuable, they're not adding anything, they just take from us, right? They just cause trouble. They are a problem rather than part of what makes us beautiful and great as a country. Then you can see how in a moment when a Black person is at your mercy and begging you for help, you're deaf to their cries, you're deaf to their humanity, because it was long ago decided that they weren't valued.
Right.
You know?
I understand.
So it really is more of, this is the child that has come out of those years of investment. You know, this is the product.
Right. And I want to make a connection to Brazil right now, and I don't want in any way like compare like struggles of you know, Brazilians. I believe they're, you know, they're different cultures, different struggles, different histories, but it's interesting that we have seen many cases like George Floyd's here in Brazil. For example, we had a little boy called João Pedro. He was only 14 years old. He was killed at home by the police because they were allegedly looking for drugs in his house, which somebody said that there were drugs there, or drug dealers or anything. So they just entered the house like shooting, and he was only 14 years old. He died. there was this little girl, Agatha Felix. She was only 8 years old. Also, she was killed by the police. She was inside a car when the police were like shooting to also allegedly people who were drug dealers, and like them, also there was a case. There was like a really shocking case of a whole family it was a black family, and they were just driving their car in a poor community here in Brazil, and they just the police just shot the car, also like assuming that they were like criminals or whatever, and there were like 80 shots in that car, 80 shots. So like I see that happening there in America, see that happening here in Brazil. Um, why do you think like I know like you might not have like the knowledge of our culture and everything, but why do you think uh, when these things happen and people they just don't just they go on with their lives and they are not like what's happening in America, they are protesting against these injustices?
Yeah, I think I think for the similar reasons that we see that officer or those officers participating in the killing of Mr. Floyd, right? There is this message that is constantly sent about who and what people with my skin are, right? And if we think about, I'll just give this definition. One of the words that we often use here is something called white privilege. And
Okay.
when people hear that term, they assume that it means easy. It means in their minds that white people have never had any struggle or any pain, and therefore they will push back on that term by saying, oh, look at all the ways that my family had it hard. Look at all the ways that we suffered, as evidence that they did not have it easy. But that is a complete misunderstanding of what that term means. White privilege says that because of your skin color, you are assumed to have value. You are assumed to be competent. You're assumed to be capable. You're assumed to be intelligent. And it's up to you to prove me wrong. Right? As my skin color, white privilege says I am not assumed to be intelligent or competent or capable, and it's up to me to prove that wrong. And so if the assumption going in is that you are good, then you can see how the approach in policing you would be very different, right? I would go to you assuming that you are good, and you would have to do something that would indicate to me that you are not, and therefore I may change my tactic. But if I go into it assuming that people who look like me are a criminal, are not good, are inherently animalistic and bad in some way, then you can see how your efforts to police me are ones that are full of aggression, are ones that are completely centered around this overreaction and this hyper usage of force, right? Because you're expecting and you've already decided who I am and what I am, and only after I've done some miracle to prove to you that I'm not, then you may retreat and back down a little bit. And it's that inequity that creates the privilege, right? If everyone had it, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be privilege, it would just be white. But we don't all have it.
How do you respond like to white people saying they say like, so do I have to feel guilty about my privilege? Do I have to feel guilty about being white?
Absolutely not. I mean, you didn't choose to be white any more than I chose to be black, right? The blackness and the whiteness are just what they are. It's like my hair being curly and yours not. It's just a characteristic. It has nothing to do with who we actually are. So you don't need to feel guilty about being who God made you to be. But what you do have when you realize you have privilege, is anybody should when they realize they have privilege, is to use that privilege to make sure that there's an equal footing for everyone in the spaces where their voices are larger and more amplified than other voices. So if I walk in, if you come into my home and you know, let's say we go visit my family and something is broken, right? And let's just pretend that my mom assumed that because you're the visitor, it must be you. I
Yeah.
can I can use my privilege and say, no, I know Felipe, he actually would not do that. And I can
Mm,
advocate for you in a way that
mm,
even if you said it to her, perhaps, I mean, my
mm.
mom's pretty awesome, so she would believe you. But if, but if you tried to advocate for yourself, it probably would not have the same weight as it would as if I said it, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
knowing that I have that privilege, I can now exercise and stand for you and support you and create space for you in a way that you could not walk into our home and
Hmm.
create that space for yourself. So if we're in a society that constantly, again, says you're more valuable than I am, well, when you take a seat at the table and you notice that I'm not there, you can use your privilege and say, where is Dr. Nika? Where's her seat? Right? You can use your
Right.
privilege to say, I believe she had a point to make. Let's give her space and have her say it. You can say, well, these chairs are really nice and comfortable, but they only fit my body type. I don't see anybody else's body
Right.
type being
Right.
considered. Have we thought about that? Those are all the
Right.
ways you can use your privilege. So
Right.
guilt comes up because it's a natural feeling when you realize
Right.
that you have something that others may not have.
Yeah.
But take that guilt and turn it into action, because what it signals is you have a responsibility to use that
Exactly.
privilege to make sure that others get to enjoy the same rights that you get.
And being aware is the first step, right?
Exactly.
That you have that, and you can use that to um, just break that cycle of privilege, right?
Exactly.
So I have an interesting question here. I was gonna leave for the end, but let's just do it.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Some Nuremberg. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but don't you think racism have to do with social and economic inequality too?
They're
I,
tied in, for sure.
right.
Right? They're
Yeah.
tied in. I think,
And before you answer, let
sure.
me just tell you about here in Brazil. I think you're gonna answer that. That's tied in, right? But here, I think there is a strong sense that uh, the the racial inequality has a lot to do with like the social inequality as well, where you see, and that's why a lot of people they say, oh, so in Brazil we don't have like a really uh, racism system going on, like, or it's not really strong here. It's more a prejudice against the poor.
Right.
That's what they say, like.
Right.
It's not about like the color, it's about you being poor or not, and there's where the prejudice is. So
Yeah. And that's interesting because
mm-hmm.
if I look around a lot of countries, the ones who are poor often are the darkest,
Yeah,
right? And that
exactly.
after a while, it stops being a coincidence.
And why is that?
But my point exactly, right? After a while, it stops being a coincidence. And so, yes, there are social inequities, and yes, class system absolutely has a lot to do with the disparities and the problems that we see. But when you think about it, there are people who have lots of money and lots of economic privilege, but because of their skin color, someone who does not have knowledge of those privileges will treat them the same way they may treat someone who is poor. So it goes further than simply just having money, because if it were that only, people like Oprah Winfrey or LeBron James or all these other famous Black people would never experience racism, and that is not the situation.
Right.
So is class and socioeconomic a huge factor? Absolutely. But is it a bigger factor than racism? I don't think so. And I say that because before you can figure out what gender I am, my sexual orientation, my religious beliefs, you see my skin. And because you see my skin, you make assumptions and conclusions about me, and then you treat me based on added information that you get. When you then figure out how much money I make or don't make, you may then think of me in a different way. When you then see that I'm a woman and not a man, you may then think of me in a different way. All these sorts of factors are moderators, but the race was the plate upon which
Right.
it was all based. And so in countries like South America and even in the Caribbean, where lots of people are sort of mixed up, you know, in terms of pigmentation, they're beautiful different shades, right, of light and brown and dark. There's often the assumption that there is no racism. There is none of that.
Right.
But what racism takes the form that racism takes in those spaces is something called colorism, right?
Okay.
Where we are valuing people based on the shading of their skin. And we think about it, the lighter you are, the more valued you are. And if we think about what that means, it's a proximity to whiteness. So the closer you are in terms of appearing white, the more valued you are in our society.
Yeah.
So isn't
And I
that
think
what racism is?
right, exactly. And I think that's what maybe happens here, and maybe that's like the main difference of what happens in America is because your race is based on your heritage, right? So if you have a parent or if you have a grandparent, and here, it's like we are so mixed here in Brazil. It's like you can't even tell like you know who my great grandparents were and then what color they were. So it's what you said. It's about your appearance, like the color that in your skin appears. And so I'm learning that this is called colorism.
Yeah,
right?
It is. Yeah, it is. And again, it's all based on the proximity to whiteness, right? That the closer you are to being perceived as or close to being white, the more value you're assigned, the more value you're assumed to have. And so when we think about this tie that it has with economics, well, if I have a hotel and my hotel is huge for tourism and I want to appear as though I'm an elite hotel, then if I have a colorist mindset, I'm going to think, well, all these foreigners are going to want to see people who, again, society says are beautiful and the best that we have to offer. Then I'm going to start all of a sudden hire the lighter skinned people. And maybe have darker skinned people work in the back. They'll work to clean the rooms, but not be at the concierge desk welcoming the guests. Or maybe I won't hire them at all because I don't want that kind in my space. And now we have people who are darker not being able to get jobs and not being able to move up in those companies. And so their economic wealth is stagnated while those who are lighter don't have those similar limitations. And so now we have a disparity in economics. But it didn't start there. It started with decisions that were made based on skin color. And so, yes, class absolutely plays a role, but I think we would be completely misdirected if we assumed that this was solely a class issue when the heart started with somebody saying that some people were lesser than others based only on how much their melanin they had in their skin.
Right. And so we've been talking about like the big picture, right? Structural racism and white privilege. But I want to talk about a little bit of what this looks like in everyday life, what racism looks like. I learned a new term this week that I didn't know before, which is microaggression, right? And I immediately, when I learned this term, and I want you to talk about it if you can, our president here, Bolsonaro, only 2 weeks ago, he was giving an interview and he was saying talking about how he's being persecuted by the media and everything, and how everything is racism, and how, he can even joke with his black friend when he's playing soccer, saying that he cited that his joke was that he was a little burnt when he was born, or he was a little overcooked, and then he was like, "Oh, so this is racism now. I cannot even joke about it." So is this what microaggression looks like, and is this what racism looks like in everyday life?
Absolutely. So racial microaggressions are these everyday common insults, invalidations, slights that are negative often and are directed toward a targeted group. And the best way I can sort of describe it is, if I were to cut your arm, that would be overtly offensive, and everyone watching would know that I just did that, right?
Okay.
And they'll
Yeah.
probably, for the most part, say that that was wrong. But if I pinched you, I could
Yeah.
be like, oh, I didn't really mean to, or I didn't even think
Right.
I pinched you. I just like brushed your
Mm-hmm.
arm. You'd have a harder time proving that A, I pinched you, or B, that I was being malicious to you in some way. But you
Okay.
have the sting of the pinch,
Okay.
and you yourself may be left wondering, well, did you mean that? Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. And that sort of uncertainty is what makes it micro, right?
Okay.
And so now think about me coming and pinching you every single day for 40 days in the same spot, right?
Sorry, you got cut out a little bit.
What?
Sorry, you're breaking up. Can you
Do
repeat that?
you see me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Imagine me pinching you every single day in the same spot. For 40 days, right? After a while, that severed arm seems like a piece of cake compared to getting pinched repeatedly in that area. And the 41st time that I pinch you, you may have this reaction, and the rest of the people watching may say, why are you behaving like that? It was just a pinch. And I don't understand what your problem is. Or they may say, I didn't see it as a pinch. I think he was just playing. It wasn't that big of a deal. But for you, you've been receiving it over and over and over again, and it weighs on you, and it has these huge impacts on your body and how you feel and how you engage with the rest of the world. Now, anytime someone passes by you, you may flinch and you may have all these reactions. And so racial microaggressions are these little slights and cuts that people of color often get. And when they speak about it, it's often brushed off as a joke. It's often brushed off as they are overreacting. It's often brushed off as something that's inconsequential and maybe didn't even happen the way that they think that it happened. And so that's why it's invalidating. That's why it's an insult. That's why it's a slight. And it can often be presented in positive language, like, oh my gosh, you're so articulate. Which sounds like they're complimenting you, but really it's implying that people who look like you aren't. So you are special, right?
Okay.
It's saying, oh my gosh, your hair is so curly. Where's your family from? Implying that there must be something different about me and my heritage, and I couldn't possibly just be black. Right. There are all these sorts of things that, again, even when they're spun with a negative tone, the implication is not a very good one. And because they are micro, they get brushed aside and they get minimized. But the impact, and we have research to back this up, the impact is a very real one. Because
so that was my next question. Like, you as a clinical psychologist, what are the psychological effects of these microaggressions? And sometimes they're not even that micro, but how does it work in someone's mind when they're constantly being suffering these aggressions?
Yeah, so the research is showing that racial microaggressions have the profound psychological impact on people of color in a way that insulting just being around someone who's rude does not. Because what often happens is you have people will dismiss the reality of racial microaggressions by saying, well, that's just a rude person being rude, right? If they were rude, it's fine. But the research is showing that there's a different quality to those experiences that everyday common rudeness does not have. And so a psychological impact would be increased rates of depression, increased rates of anxiety. We see increased suicidality happening, right, among people who are constantly exposed to these racial microaggressions. On the physical health side, there's high rates of diabetes, there are high rates of hypertension, there's obesity. We see all of those being directly correlated with exposure to discrimination and racial microaggressions. Again, those do not exist when we're just talking about people being rude. So it's a very different kind, it hits you in a different way from someone not saying excuse me to someone saying, oh my gosh, where's your family from? Are you really Brazilian, or did you come from somewhere else?
Right.
That hits you in a very different way.
Right. If you don't mind my asking, like, what is your personal experience with all that? Was that something that triggered you to study this and to go into psychology? Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. So I can honestly say that I've never had someone be overtly racist toward me, which thank God I don't want them to be.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
And for a long time, I didn't want to be the Black person talking about race. I just did not want to be that person, but that's not where my life has led me, so here I am. But one incident that does stand out to me, and it was a racial microaggression. I was in grad school, and the roommates that I had at the time, we would have these house dinners where one person would cook and we would just all have a dinner together once a week. And I had one roommate who was white, well, I had two roommates who were white. One was not, and then there was me. But one of my white roommates had historically complained about her coworkers who were Black, and she would say, oh my gosh, they're so lazy and they're so gossipy. And I just thought, if she says that they are, then they probably are. I had no reason to assume that they weren't, right? But she would complain about them all the time. And we were sitting at dinner, and she was complaining about them again. And she mentioned that she was talking about the way that they spoke, and she was saying that they spoke something called Ebonics, which in New York or in America, it's really like a slang, and it's not standard English, right?
Okay.
Now, I've never been that cool to use Ebonics in my life. I've always sounded like this. So to say that I use Ebonics just did not make any sense, right? And so to have her say that, she just went on, she said, well, they kind of sound like you, Anica. And I said, they're like me. She says, well, yeah, they are. And for the first time, that really hit me, because it helped me to see it didn't matter how much education I had. It didn't matter how well I spoke. It didn't matter how my family was composed or any of that. If you saw a Black person and you made assumptions about them, you would have put those same assumptions upon me. And the fact that we lived in the same house and you knew my character and you knew who I am didn't really seem to make a difference to you, And I did bring it to her attention, and she was very apologetic. But nevertheless, it left a mark, because it helped me to see that the way that I was being perceived, despite all my qualities, was not being recognized, because someone had decided long ago who I was, right? So things like that.
Just assumptions, right?
Exactly.
Making assumptions.
Exactly.
And how do we fight that? How do we undo all these assumptions that it's just like considered normal in society?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is so important is continuing to have conversations. Like I said in the beginning, I firmly believe in the power of talking, and I think that it's in that space we have the opportunity to develop understanding. With that understanding, we can build empathy. Through empathy, we can have insight and collaboration, and then we make change, right? And so if I'm sitting with you, if I get to know you as a person, if I'm sharing life with you, then when you tell me about something that is hurting you, I am listening, I'm understanding what that is, I'm empathizing with that, and I'm able to collaborate with you to bring about change. So I think we have to be willing to talk, but we also have to be willing to build relationships with people who don't look like us. And I mean being nice to the person who pumps your gas or gives you water at the restaurant. That's just being a decent person, right? I mean, in your inner circle, the people you want to call in the middle of the night when you need counsel because something's not going right or something just went amazingly right. Or any of those people who do not look like you in terms of skin color or any of those racial status that we use. And if the answer is no, then it's important that you get some of those people in there,
That's
right?
amazing. Yeah. And that's like a question. I'm going to go through some questions.
Sure.
And my friend Ellen, she's asking, I think you just answered that. How can white people effectively contribute to the fight against racism? So we talked about that, like, you know, just first we talked with, in the beginning, being aware, right? So I think awareness is key.
Absolutely. I think awareness is key. I think it's using your privilege.
Conversation.
Yeah. And using your privilege in spaces that you have a lot of power and voice. I also think it's recognizing how you benefit from
Right.
things being as they are and how others do not. Because it's hard to see, it's hard to change something you don't acknowledge, right? And so being able to see and to recognize that, when I walked into this store, all these people came to me and asked me how I was doing, and they smiled. But when that guy walked in, they were following him all around the store. And so recognizing that, and then talking to the manager and asking, what is your policy here? Because again, you have that ability to speak and be listened to in a way that people with darker skin may not be.
And I think to me, like, it's just like what I don't see a lot of people not doing is listening. You know, like a lot of people are just really keen to just say and then say their opinion, say what is right and what's not, and I don't think this is fair. And then they have their own opinion about racism when they're white, and they haven't gone through any of those experiences themselves, right? I have here my other friend, Dr. André Pessoa. He's a neurologist. He's a neurologist for children, so he's very respected in his field. He does lectures all around the world about, and he was in the research groups for the Zika virus.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and he's asking, Dr. Anica, we've seen white people disgusted with what happened and supporting the protesters. And what do you think about that?
I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing because for so long, conversations about race have been placed at the feet of people of color to either lead them or to have them, as though it's something that we created or we sort of made and perpetuate, when in actuality, it was something that was imposed upon us, right? And so really, it's impossible to change the system unless everyone who is part of the system participates.
And we are all part of it.
We're all part of the system. Yeah. And for me, one of the things that I do just in my clinical work, whenever anybody sits in front of me, especially white people, I always ask them, how do you identify racially or ethnically? And a lot of times, white people will say, white, right? It's almost a foreign concept to them, not realizing that they too have a racial identity. They too are a race. And it's not just a thing that Black people, Asian people, Latino people have to deal with. They are over here. So seeing yourself as part of the system and as one of the many races and what is my place in that is what helps us. And I see a lot of people doing that in this protesting.
Yeah. And it's very interesting what you just said, and just a little bit of like the cultural differences between the US and Brazil. It's interesting for us and it was for me, like when I first came to America, if people don't know, like I've lived 7 years in New York. So it was interesting to me that in every form, if you are at a doctor's office, if you're applying for a job, if you are at university, there is that question for you to identify your ethnicity, your race. And then I was like, oh, it's interesting. Like I was never labeled before.
Right.
You know, like in Brazil, like nobody asks you, like, are you Black, you're brown, you know, like, so, and then I had to choose, like, sometimes they had Hispanic or Latino, and then sometimes if they didn't have Latino, I would be forced to put Hispanic, which we're not because we don't speak Spanish. So it was interesting, you know, like how this is really strong in the US, like this, how do you identify yourself, right? And then leading to that question, there's my other friend, Yaja. She's a psychologist as well. She's asking in Portuguese. She's asking like what types of public policy in the United States there are specifically for Black people.
And what do you mean by public policies?
Meaning like I believe you call it affirmative.
Affirmative action.
Yeah, like diversity programs and things like that.
So,
Like for example, for spots in universities and jobs, or do you have a minimum for for Black people or for Latinos,
so yes and no. So affirmative
Okay.
action is a policy that was put in place because for so long, going back to what I said before with systemic racism, for so long, there was no room for people who were not white. And in an effort to force institutions and places of employment to create space for people who were not white, and for women, and for people who were LGBT, and all those other things, affirmative action was put in place, right?
Okay.
And so it's not
That
just,
was when? Sorry.
I don't remember.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Sadly, I should know that, but I don't.
Sorry.
Know.
That's not a history
That is totally
lie.
fine. I'm not a historian, sadly, but I will look it up. But what is important, though, is that it was put in place to create space for people of those underprivileged groups. Mm-hmm. And so it's not something that's there for Black people. It's there for all people who've been underprivileged in some way. And but what has happened is that the ones who benefited the most from it are white women, because if you're a space that has very little desire to have a true diversity of people, and you have to choose some form of diversity, well, you probably will pick the white woman over anybody else.
Okay.
That white women have benefited more from affirmative action than any
Really?
other group in the country, which is fine. But what's problematic there is that we then see arguments about not creating space for people of color with them pointing to affirmative action. So they'll say, oh, well, affirmative action is, you're taking spots for qualified people because affirmative action is forcing us to have to accept you. When in actuality, the few people of color who do get accepted have to be the best of the best, when many white people who are accepted are not necessarily the best of the best.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not as if people are saying, well, because you're Black, we're going to take you. It's like you have to be the best of the best. And even then, when you worked your way into that, you're being told you're only here because affirmative action said we had to, or people are questioning your qualifications and your competency for being there and pointing to affirmative action. So a law that was made to even and create a little bit more space for people is often weaponized to be used to shame and insult and marginalize some of those people.
Right. Yeah. And the same thing happens here. We don't have a lot of public policy regarding that. We do have like at public universities, which here we have like public and private universities, and the private universities have to pay, the public ones you don't have to pay. So previous governments, they started this sort of like a diversity program where there was like a certain number of places, spots for Black people or for indigenous people, and they're the same criticism. Then they're like, oh, so just because they're Black, they're getting accepted into university, they have the same sort of criticism. But I believe like in the US, I see even more of that, because I see companies doing that as well, right? So they have diversity programs, which I don't see it very much here, and then you can see, and like you can see like companies with all white, and the majority of Brazilians are dark skinned, are Black. We have the majority. Brazil is the country with the most African descent people in the world.
Wow.
Right? But you see the people in power are white, and the
Right.
people on TV, they're white, and then
Right.
the journalists, and so we still lack these kinds of programs here.
And it can
So
be because
yeah,
all the people are poor, right?
exactly.
It can be. And so again, that goes back to the earlier point that it's all
Yeah.
economics and not race. At some point, it stops being about economics.
Hmm. And yeah, and one question here, Dr. Nika, do you think racism is taught?
Absolutely. It's a behavioral thing. It's not something that any child upon the day they're born has. It's something that you learn in your environment. But the beautiful thing is you can unlearn it, right? And so again, going back to recognizing your privilege, going back to having that awareness, having the willingness to use your privilege in spaces where others do not have it, to make it more equal, being willing to talk and to form friendships and relationships with people who don't look like you, and being willing to call wrong things wrong, regardless of who is in charge, is a way that we can show not only that we've unlearned it, but help others to unlearn it as well.
Right. Amazing. There's so much to cover, but so little time. Uh, do you have any final thoughts or something that you would like to share? And also, I wanted you, if you could, talk about like what's the general sentiment right now in American people, like with all this that's happening. I hear a lot, people talking about hurt.
Yeah.
How's that going over there?
Yeah, I think the sentiment is a mixture of outrage and sadness and and a tiny bit of hope, all mixed
Okay.
in together. And the outrage comes from just the blatant ugliness that we're seeing, right, with these killings. We see the murder of Mr. Floyd, we see the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, we see the murder of Breonna Taylor when she was shot and killed in her house at night by police officers who entered without warning, right? We see all of that happening, and no, either none or very, very slow accountability for these.
Right.
And there's an outrage that just comes from that because it's built upon years and years of those same behaviors going unchallenged, unaccounted for. And so there's a lot of outrage, there's a lot of sadness because you see human life being taken away, and again, no one is being held to the standard that they should be as a result of that. And you see a system so broken that it makes you sad and a little bit worried that how could it ever be undone, fixed. But hopeful because you look at the protesters and you see their tenacity, you see their willingness to come out day after day, you see the diversity among them, not just in racial identity, but in age and status. You just see all of them there, and then you see it echoed around the world when you have people in Paris who don't look at all like you protesting for someone who does look like you. That really does something to your heart.
Yeah.
So
And
there's a bit of hope.
it's forcing, yeah, and it's forcing like Brazil talk about it, like something everybody's talking about here, which is something that's been avoided for some time.
For so long. And again, I think the coronavirus forced us to have the conversation that for 400 years we have been unwilling to have.
Right. Yes, that's great. I think we have time for one last question, 3 minutes, because the Instagram Live, they just have this limit of 1 hour.
Okay.
So Doctor, on that episode, he's asking, Dr. Nick, in your opinion, are there many differences between Obama and Trump governments regarding racism?
Oh, yes, 1,000%. Yes. If just on a really quick one, it's just the way in which they each talk in regard Black people or people of color. I'll give you an example. When there were white supremacist KKK leaning people marching in Charlottesville, they were saying things like Jews will not replace us, and they were clearly not interested in any sort of racial diversity. They were all about white supremacy. When asked about that, Trump came out and said things like, well, you know, there are fine people on both sides of the aisle, meaning that people who were against the protesters and those who were protesting, that on either side, they were good people, that they weren't all bad. But then you see people protesting in the streets because of what has happened to Mr. Floyd, and he says, we should stick the dogs on them, they're vicious thugs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just
Yeah.
the language alone is telling you that this is a person who does not see people equally or value them in the same way. When we had white protesters here saying that they did not want to stay in their homes anymore, they wanted to get haircuts because COVID was just basically annoying to them, I guess, and they refused to believe that people were dying because of it. They were out with guns and AK-15s and all these things right in the faces of the police officers, challenging them. They stormed City Hall and had military weaponry. And he said, you know, they are just good people who want to fight, have their say. He defended them and said that they had a right to do this, and they were just tired of the overreach by governors. Again, you see the protesters out with Mr. Floyd, and he is saying things like, you know, if you start looting, we'll start shooting. Those kinds of language that he sick the policemen and put tear gas and pepper bullets on peaceful protesters who are advocating for racial equity, and be quiet to protesters with armed weaponry asking for haircuts, right?
Yeah.
So you just see that disparity, and you know, not even going yet to policy, but just on the surface of that, you know, that is a very different person than President Obama.
Right. Yeah. That's staggering, like to hear all that. And it's not very different here in Brazil. The same style of, you know, like comments and same things happening pretty much because basically Bolsonaro, our president, is like sort of like a copycat of Trump, you know, so
Yeah.
everything he does. But yeah, that's so sad to see how like people in power, they have like, they can contribute greatly to it, for a change or not, and for
Yeah.
things to get worse or not. And that's happening right now. Like we saw progress with Obama, and now we see all that gone with that sort of behavior from the president, right?
That's right. And
Yeah.
so my closing word, I guess my encouragement to everyone watching is that even though it can feel hopeless and you may feel outraged by the injustice that is all around us, I do think it's important to recognize the places that you have power in. Because when you have power, you are able to bring about change and equity, right? So if it's in your family, the way that family members talk about other people who don't look like you guys, you can challenge them on that, right? The way your friend group, the way that who you allow into your group and who you don't, you have some control and power over that. If you have any sort of leadership position, who's allowed into your organization, who gets a say in how things are done and who doesn't. You could have people who look like me, but if they just have to agree with you in order to stay, then that's not a very diverse or healthy space, you know? So really think about the spaces that you inhabit and how you can really ensure that you're making room for those who don't look like you. And then you can use your vote. You can vote. You can understand who is in charge, who's making policy decisions. Do I agree with those policies? Do I not? And if I don't, how can I do something about it, right? How can I educate the people in my city about what's happening so that we can either get people out or put them in? So there's a lot of power that's there, and with us exercising our respective power, we really can make the change that we hope to see.
Yes.
And that makes me hopeful.
Yeah. Let's do something. We have one more question. Let's stop it, and then I'm gonna start a new one.
Okay.
And then you can join me as well. The question is, not sure if you have addressed it, but do you think the new generation will behave different and racism will disappear? So that's the question.
Oh.
So yeah, so I'm gonna end it now, and I'm gonna start a new one, and then you answer that question, and you have our final thoughts.
That's
All right.
good.
All right. Thanks.